and that web address is on a slide forthcoming, so you'll see it. Today's forum is presented by the North Central Washington Forest Health Collaborative, of which the Methow Valley Citizens Council is one of 22 member groups or entities. They're listed on this slide that make up the Forest Health Collaborative. And since 2013, with facilitation from the Upper Columbia Salmon Recovery Board in Wenatchee, Washington, we've been working together to gain resources and support to accelerate landscape scale forest restoration in Chelan and Okanagan counties. The purpose of the Forest Health Collaborative is to advance forest health through a blend of actions that improve forest resilience, preserve terrestrial habitats and aquatic habitats, and support local economies in both counties. And the forest restoration strategy is the underpinning of the work of the collaborative, which we will hear more about shortly. So this evening, we are delighted to have with us two ecologists at the forefront of forest restoration across the West. Both are part scientist and part land manager, and they are effectively applying their expertise on the ground through quantifiable metrics used to guide forest health treatments. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guest speakers, Bill Gaines and Derek Churchill. Derek Churchill, who will present second, is a forest ecologist who focuses on applying ecological knowledge to on-the-ground forest management challenges across the Pacific Northwest. Derek has been the author on numerous scientific papers, and the last time I checked, those papers were cited well over 1,700 times since 2017. Derek works for the Washington State Department of Natural Resources Forest Resilience Division, which was created in 2019 to achieve the agency's mission to manage, sustain, and protect the health and productivity of Washington's lands and waters to meet the needs of present and future generations. The Forest Resilience Division works across all lands, state, federal, private, and in the interest of all Washingtonians to sustain and increase the health and resilience of our forests and local communities, and values forest support for the well-being of people, communities, wildlife, and landscapes for today and into the future. So Derek, thank you for joining us this evening. I look forward to hearing from you. And next, and first up, is Bill Gaines. Bill is a wildlife ecologist and the director of Washington Conservation Science Institute, which I encourage you to learn more about on their website, waconservationscience.com. Bill's been involved in wildlife research and forest management for the past 3 decades. For 27 years, he was a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Forest Service, during which time he served as the team lead and developed the Okanagan-Wenatchee Forest Restoration Strategy. Bill will provide a history and overview of the restoration strategy, including key issues that are addressed and how the best available science was integrated. He will conclude with a look at key forest restoration principles developed over many years of research and implementation. Bill, thanks for your time this evening, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. I appreciate that introduction. And let me get my screen going here. All right, can everybody see that okay? Okay, well, thanks for that introduction. And as Sam mentioned, I was in a previous life, wildlife biologist with the Forest Service. And as part of that, I was a member of a team. I was one of the team leaders during the late 2000s, early 2010s, when we were in the process of developing the strategy. I do have a little cartoon on the side that says how birds see the world. That's my reminder that this is how Bill sees the world. And I'm here speaking on behalf of myself and not representing any other agency or organization except my own. It's just that I've been around long enough to have some history with this strategy. So I think I can give a reasonably good recollection of sort of how it evolved and what preceded it and kind of what's happened since. So my goal here is to just familiarize you with the history of the strategy. What are the sort of main components of it that we utilize? What's the tool set basically we utilize to assess a landscape and evaluate the restoration needs so we can do good focused work that enhances landscape and watershed resiliency. And then, as Sam mentioned, drawing from these years of experience to develop these guiding principles. It's interesting just in pulling this history together, I realized that the focus that the Okanagan Wenatchee took on forest restoration goes all the way back to the mid 90s actually, so well over 20 years. It was initially the focus was on just focus more on the dry forest, but it was a partnership, if you will, and a long-standing collaboration between the Wenatchee Forestry Sciences Lab and the forest. It goes, like I mentioned, it goes way back, but in my era, one of the major sort of milestones was when the East Side Forest Health Assessment was done. This was a congressionally legislated assessment that was led by Rich Everett, who was the science team leader at the Wenatchee Forestry Sciences Lab at the time. That assessment came out in the mid 90s, and it really began to highlight the changes that had occurred as a result of past management and fire exclusion, et cetera, in many of our forests, and especially in the dry forest. It was that assessment actually, and the 1994 fires, which were a major fire year here in this part of the world, that led to the forest to develop what they called the dry forest strategy. And the dry forest strategy was really nothing more. I'll talk about it a little bit more here in a minute, but it was just a way of focusing resources on those areas that the forest health assessment had shown were in the most need. That strategy, again, was developed in collaboration with many of the scientists that were involved in the forest health assessment. Following that, in the 2000s era, we were involved with a couple of studies, large scale studies. It involved researchers from the research station and university researchers. Those studies, the Pendleton and the Firefire Surrogate, those were focused on understanding the stand level effects of doing different types of forest restoration treatments. They looked at things like fire, using prescribed fire only, using just forest thinning, mechanical thinning, or using a combination of both. And they were interdisciplinary in that we looked at the effects on soils, we looked at effects on fuels, understory, overstory vegetation, wildlife, a whole host of resources were addressed in this study. And so that sort of basic grounding of science, that basic baseline of science, which quite honestly, the Okanagan Wenatchee area, Eastern Washington here, is extremely rich in local science as a result of this collaboration. It was that formed the basis for us then to essentially adapt the dry forest strategy into something a little more broadly applicable to multiple forest types, and also addressing some of the issues that came around as a result of increased fires and climate change that we were seeing in our forests. So the dry forest strategy that I mentioned was a result came around after the 94 fires and the forest health assessment, and really all it really did was it was a way for the forest to focus their limited resources in the places that seemed to need the attention most, and that was in the dry forest. We had a lot of years of implementing that tool set, and a lot of learning and, like I mentioned, a good collaboration with research. So in 2008, some additional national policy came into place that really focused the Forest Service on ecological restoration and resiliency. This was where it was really formalized into policy, and a lot of that work was going on in response to the Forest Service's strategic plan around climate change. So it was timely that this policy came around, because at the same time we were looking at how should we update our dry forest strategy, like I say, to be more holistic. And so we worked under both the science and the monitoring that we had learned, and the new policy, to develop the first version of the restoration strategy in 2010. And it helped better address both climate science and landscape ecology compared to the previous dry forest strategy. It was a tremendous amount of effort and teamwork to pull the strategy together. It took us a couple of years. I was one of the team leaders along with Richie Herod. As you can see from the list of folks here, we had a combination of managers and researchers, had a really good collaboration with the landscape ecology team at the Forestry Sciences Lab. It was a interdisciplinary effort in that we had expertise from a wide range of resource areas that were covered in the strategy development team. As you can see, we put together a communications team because the forest realized that the importance of sharing this with partners. And I'll walk you through some of the processes that we went through to be sure we took advantage of getting a lot of eyes on this process and some broaden the ownership. So we had a team that helped us sort of craft that communication strategy, if you will. We started after our team was formed and formally sanctioned by the forest. Our first step was to go to the field and sit down with planning teams at the district level, those folks that were working on projects day-to-day basis, and understand what the major issues were we should focus our strategy around. And this slide sort of gives you a summary of what those issues were. The first one is just, how do you define restoration? What does it mean? And how do you measure whether you're getting there? And it was, again, around a new policy, which also brought in this term called resiliency. And so it's just some definitions of some of the terminology was needed. We were also trying to address an issue that was raised by the district folks, that they were good at doing stand level management, but it was difficult to understand how stands added up to create more resilient at a landscape scale. So some way of sort of setting some context from a landscape perspective, and how's each individual stand measure into that context. There was a lot of discussion around risk reduction in late successional reserves. Late successional reserves are a land designation that came in as the Northwest Forest Plan came about and amended the existing forest plans on the Okanagan-Wenatchee. The Northwest Forest Plan emphasized reducing the risk of habitat loss to fire in these late successional reserves, which are large areas of habitat for late successional species like spotted owls. But a good measure of sort of a risk reduction or a risk assessment tool was another issue that was highlighted. How do managers create that balance between managing for habitat that is dense and full of fuels and highly flammable on the one hand, at the same point reducing the risk of habitat loss? What are some of the tools that are available to do that? We wanted better integration among the resources, and some of that had to do with how do we manage for spotted owls, at the same time do these silviculture treatments that reduce the effects of fire, reduce the impacts of fire, and restore fire regimes. So better integration around those three primary resources. There were others, aquatics certainly came in, but in this initial effort anyway, was really focused on those three areas. A lot of discussion around big and old trees and how to manage big and old trees. That's not directly addressed in any of the existing forest plans. It wasn't addressed in the Northwest Forest Plan. So what is a big old tree, and what is an old tree? And then, how should we proceed with the management? A lot of discussion around the existing road network, the recognition that roads are important in terms of allowing the treatments to occur, but they do have a significant impact on a whole host of environments, and in particular, the aquatic environment. And then there was a lot of concern around just the length of time it was taking to get through planning. Hear the same sort of stories today. We did make an attempt to address this, and I'll share with you sort of how we thought we'd go about that. So we started the strategy development in 2008. We started with a pilot project down on the southern end of the forest, down at the Natchez district. That pilot project was called Dry Ore. It was a landscape that allowed us to develop some of the tools and kind of learn as we went, and then refine the strategy into what you see as the 2010 version. The most recent version of the strategy is actually the 2012 version. The only real difference between the 2010 version and the 2012 was the 2012 was put together pretty quickly, and we took some time between 2010 and 2012 to better create a document that's more user-friendly and had more a better story, I guess, if you will, more of a user guide, if you will. So that's the main difference between those two. We went through a series of reviews to make sure we were getting the right science and interpreting the science in the right way and not missing anything key. We also went through a district review. So in addition to kind of visiting with the districts early on, after we came up with some ideas, we went back and we actually pulled together district planning teams, and they used early drafts for the strategy. They were doing essentially pretend planning and giving us feedback on what was working and what wasn't. We had access at that point in time to what was known as a provincial advisory committee. It was a formally sanctioned committee under the Northwest Forest Plan. Those advisory committees essentially evolved into what we know as now our collaboratives, but it was similar in that it represented on that committee, there was a wide range of interests and diversity of backgrounds were participating in that review. So that went through the document went through several reviews to develop that 2010 version. These are the reviewers from the science panel. There's some pretty heavy hitters in the group. And we benefited from having, again, a diversity of specialists, including aquatic ecologists that gave us feedback on the science aspects and the application. So that led up basically to the version of the strategy, the most current version, which is the 2012 version. And now I want to just shift slightly and talk to the kind of the key elements that are within that strategy, and walk you through those elements to some degree, and realizing again that this is an outcome of a lot of collaboration and a lot of eyes on this. So it took 2 years, but it was a process that was worth the time just to gain the collaborative nature of it, of the process. So the landscape evaluation, again, we were addressing some of those issues that were raised by the district. And then at a finer scale, we have another component we call key ecological features. And those are also addressing some of the issues, but at a stand level or within stand level that were raised by the district. So these are the components of the strategy that relate to those issues raised by the local planners. And then we also talked to the idea of efficient planning. And in the strategy, we set a goal of increasing our footprint, doubling our footprint within the first 10 years of implementing the strategy. And we're at that 10-year point now. So I apologize for the wording on this slide, but it is a central tenet of the whole restoration strategy process, this idea of a landscape evaluation. In the Northwest Forest Plan, there was a similar tool. It was called a watershed assessment. But that tool set has evolved from when the Northwest Forest Plan was put together to become more holistic and to have a different set of evaluation um, ways of sort of diagnosing the condition, yes, the health, if you will, of a forest and an ecosystem. So this is a basic foundation of the strategy. So it's pretty important that we understand this a bit. And I'll delve in a little bit into some of the highlighted, the areas, the components of landscape evaluation as we go. But landscape evaluations concerned with the restoration of ecosystems might be based on a set of ecological measures against and comparing those against reference conditions. So we're interested in restoring ecosystems. And now what we had to do as part of our strategy was identify what are a set of ecological measures or indicators that we can use to diagnose the health of the system, but not make it so complicated and not try to do everything, but just enough so that we get a good idea of where this system is relevant to these reference conditions. And I'll share with you what these reference conditions are. So it's really a measure of the ecological health, if you will, of an ecosystem. Reference conditions are really valuable in that they provide an objective measure of a current landscape. And they also paint a picture for what a more resilient or a resilient landscape or watershed can look like. So they not only tell you where you're at now, but they give you some good indicators and where you want to be if you want to improve resiliency. So we chose a couple of different types of reference conditions for us to use in our restoration strategy process and our landscape evaluation. We relied very heavily on the research that the landscape ecology group, Paul Hesberg and his team had done throughout the inland west. They did a lot of historical landscape reconstructions, and they developed some tools that allow us to compare current condition to this historical range of variation. And I'll show you kind of what that looks like. We're using another tool that Paul and his lab developed. We're able to look at what would those range of conditions look like if the climate gets warmer and drier out 50 years or so. And so what it allowed us to do was to take a current condition of a landscape, look in the rear view mirror basically and say, where did that landscape come from? What was it like historically prior to pre-settlement conditions? And what is it likely to look like as the climate gets warmer and drier? And we do that by looking at a variety of indicators. And those indicators often include not only the amount of a particular habitat or a particular forest type, but also how that forest type is currently arranged across the landscape and how it was arranged historically and into the future. We know that how that arrangement lies on those landscapes is really key in terms of how things like fire move across these landscapes. So not just understanding the amount of those, but the spatial sort of patterning of them is really key. Typically, a landscape evaluation includes 2 to 5 what we call sub-watersheds. Those sub-watersheds, they kind of range from 75, so a planting area or a landscape evaluation area might be 75 to 150,000 acres, sometimes even a little bit bigger. And we do these across ownerships, irregardless of ownership, because it gives us a way of assessing where the treatments are the most important and effective. And sometimes that is independent of ownership. So a lot of times it requires a good collaboration on these landscape scale projects across ownerships. One of the first steps that we do, unfortunately, we don't have access to data that has reasonable resolution that we can use in these landscape evaluations just off the shelf. A lot of the vegetation and habitat information is very broad scale, and it doesn't work well for example, within a watershed. So one of the first steps that we undergo is this thing called photo interpretation. And we do this with, this is a computerized step where we have access to really high res imagery. Our photo interpreters wear 3D glasses like they're in a movie. They look kind of funny and they're probably very cross-eyed by the end of the day, but they look at these images in 3D and they identify these polygons, and then they identify a whole host of vegetation attributes associated with those polygons, like canopy closure and canopy layers and species and trees, sizes and things like that. And we use that information. So each of those polygons that are outlined in yellow there has a set of information attributed to it that we can then use to come up with a whole bunch of different kind of really cool maps. It's important that we have some quality assurance in that photo interpretation. And so we develop some quality assurance steps just to make sure the photo interpreter has time to get familiar with the area and has some way of cross-checking and some field evaluation of those photo interpreted landscapes. So we then had to come up, like I mentioned, with these set of indicators, and I'll walk you through the indicators that we currently use. These have evolved somewhat, and I'll talk to that a little bit under the DNR's landscape evaluation process, but this is how it is presented in the 2012 version of the strategy. So we look at vegetation patterns. So we look at how has the current arrangement of species composition and different types of age to forest, how has that compared to these reference conditions? And we can also in this look at insect and disease. Is the insect and disease risk higher now, or where is it compared to these reference conditions? So vegetation pattern is an important component of the resource indicators we use. We look at fire. We can look at fire from a landscape scale, saying how is fire likely to come from outside our watershed into the watershed. And then we can also look at the stand level fuel conditions. We can say how his fire how many stands are prone to high severity fire now, and how did that compare to their historical condition or their future condition. So it's a way of evaluating the potential fire behavior and addressing how do you restore that fire regime. So we can make those comparisons. We have a set of what we call focal species that we address, where we look at their habitats. Some of those species are associated with really dense older forests with larger trees and multiple layers, and some of those species are more associated with more open canopied forests where the trees are more widely spaced, and then a whole host of other species that we look at. And again, we look at both the current amount and the spatial arrangements of those habitats, and we compare those to reference conditions. We also look at a pretty in-depth evaluation of the roads, and we look at this mostly relevant to aquatics. We use it to some degree in some of the wildlife assessment, but that is one of our important indicators is what the influence that these roads are having on the aquatic environment, including things like listed fish. The result of a landscape evaluation is this thing we call a landscape prescription. And essentially it just says, when we look at these current conditions and we compare them to these reference conditions, what do we find that's sort of outside those reference conditions? What's kind of out of whack, if you will, or our official term is what's departed from these reference conditions. Maybe we have too much mid-age forest. So we have more of that and not enough of the older forest. Those are kind of like common comparisons that we make. We look at where the best potential is to do the treatments. In other words, if we have too much of that mid-age forest, where is it located? Where are the best potential areas in which we can do those treatments? So we come up with a list of potential treatment opportunities. And then we can integrate those across the different resources. So the wildlife biologist can say, hey, I have too much of this habitat and not enough of this. And the fuels person can say, oh, that's good because I need, a different fire regime here. Let's do a treatment for white-headed woodpecker habitat here because we can also accomplish fuel objectives. Those sort of things can be integrated across the resources using these tools in the landscape evaluation. And the goal here is for the landscape prescription to basically boil down the findings of the evaluation into a form that can then be used to inform a NEPA project and also implement the current management direction in our forest plans. So that's the goal of the landscape evaluation and the prescription. I apologize for some of the terminology on this slide, but don't pay too much attention to the words, but do look at the colors. So this is a tool that we developed. It takes a lot of that vegetation information and it says, okay, from a habitat perspective, how much of the habitat is overrepresented or underrepresented relative to these reference conditions. This just happens to be a diagnostic tool that we use to evaluate the forest conditions. So this is a lot like when you go to a doctor and you get a blood test, and it compares your current blood chemistry. Maybe you're looking at your a cholesterol level, and it compares that cholesterol level to a normal range of conditions. Well, what this slide shows you is the historical range of variability is in the green, the future is in the yellow, and the red marks that are vertical, those are the areas that have departed from those reference conditions. Those are the areas that you'd like to do your treatments around to make some fixes to that landscape and make it more resilient. So this is just a tool that allows all the different resource specialists to sort of diagnose their part of the landscape and start thinking about how do we make, what kind of treatments should we do. So we come up with maps like this of these restoration opportunities and some general ideas of different kinds of treatment options for both the terrestrial landscape and the aquatic landscape. So that's an overview of the landscape evaluation process and what it leads to. We then also in the strategy addressed, like it was emphasized by the district level, the district planners, this idea around these key ecological features. And in this case, a lot of discussion around large and old trees. So the strategy, because a lot of science has shown that these large trees, and we're talking, big trees, that their abundance is low on many of our landscapes as a result of past management actions. Large fires can kill them, a variety of reasons why their abundance is low. And so we emphasized retention and development of large and old trees. We also emphasized the restoration of that within stem spatial patterning. We developed some definitions that we use to define large trees and define old trees based on a lot of review of a lot of science documents around this. We did not describe any sort of diameter limit that said you cannot cut a tree over a certain size. We realized that those conditions vary by type, they vary by the forest condition, they vary by past management. So there's a lot of conditions that might be that need to be assessed at the project scale to determine the best strategy to move that stand forward relevant to large trees. But we wanted to make sure we were talking some common language. We emphasized spatial variability. There's been a lot of research done on this. Derek Churchill is certainly one of the leading scientists around this. We realized that the spatial arrangement of trees within a stand influences a lot of functions, things like insects and disease, fire spread, and how wildlife use those habitats. I know in some of the research that we've done, we find that some birds will use clumps and then they'll nest in the clump and forage in a gap. And sometimes that complex patch, which is a little bigger than a clump, provides key cover for certain types of species. So we recognize that spatial variability is really key. So it's not just how many trees, it's where and how they're arranged. And there's been a lot of good work to reconstruct the historical condition of these stands, to allow us to integrate that into our silvicultural treatments to address both the large tree and the spatial variability issue. We also talked about how to improve our planning, improve the process, and hopefully accelerate the pace and scale. And the idea here was we would do and this has actually worked out. It worked out in the pilot project in Dry Ore, where one landscape evaluation resulted in, I think, 3 different NEPA documents, if I recall. But the idea was, if we evaluate a large landscape, then we can then break that out and do several different projects within that large landscape. And as each project gets implemented, you can update the landscape evaluation, rerun the metrics, and that should help you in your analysis for your environmental assessment or whatever NEPA document process you're using. There's been deviations of this. For example, there's examples where instead of breaking it out into multiple projects, there's like a very large landscape projects that are being assessed in one environmental document. So there's some deviations, and I honestly, this is part of the process where I think for a while we saw some acceleration, and then planning processes, for a variety of reasons, the planning processes just do take time. They're very complicated. So there's probably some more thought to go into this planning efficiency and process. I do want to recognize that the 2012 version of the restoration strategy, actually the 2020 version, but it was recognized in the Spotted Owl Recovery Plan. The 2011 version of the Spotted Owl Recovery Plan, the most recent version, emphasizes ecosystem restoration, and it specifically cited the forest restoration strategy as a very good tool to use when making those trade-offs between habitat and resiliency and risk and restoration. So it got some good street cred, if you will, there. It also was instrumental in creating that science foundation that then the strategic plan around the 20-year forest health plan, the DNR plan, if you will, they utilize a similar set of tools, this idea of a landscape evaluation. Only since then, there's been a lot of new science, and Derek's team has even built some more tools and better tools to evaluate landscapes around those different resource indicators. So I think the good news is that there's a lot of consistency among these different documents, and there's a lot of utility in having that science foundation that they're based upon. So some good synergism there, if you will. So that's really a quick overview of the components of the strategy, what it was trying to develop. Now I just want to shift a little bit, and as the strategy was developed, many of us put our heads together. Paul Hesberg led this effort and put a paper together that sort of highlighted, if you will, lessons learned, or what I like to call guiding principles. I'm often asked about, if you're planning a landscape scale restoration, what are the things we should think about? Kind of what are the check boxes for what makes a good project? What makes a project that's well thought of and grounded in good science? So planning across multiple scales is really important. So how do stands add up to landscapes? And even at a broader scale, which watersheds, which landscape evaluations take priority over others? And Derek's going to share some work that he's done relevant to the DNR forest health strategy around that. But it's important that stand level management adds up to landscapes and the context. Topography is a good guide looking at where to locate treatments. South slopes have different structure than north slopes. North slopes lend themselves to certain kinds of habitat, valley bottoms, etc. So tailoring the treatments to the landscape is really key, using that topography as a guide. Restore the inherent disturbance regime, or the fire ecology, and the landscape patterning. You can see the photograph on the top, all the different patterns across that landscape. That patterning on that landscape has a lot of, it affects a tremendous number of functions. How wildlife moves through a landscape, how fire moves through a landscape, how insects affect that landscape. And our best estimate of how to create resilient landscapes come from these reference conditions. So restoring not only the spatial variability at the landscape scale, but then, as I mentioned before, that within stand spatial variability, we have Derek's ICO treatments, the individuals, clumps, and openings within a stand, and how we arrange those trees. Again, the importance of large and old trees, the ecological impacts of roads, and then it's important to conduct these evaluations across ownerships. So those are the guiding principles, and I think you can hopefully it's fairly obvious how those guiding principles evolved from the strategy, and they still form a solid science basis for the strategy. And that is all I have.
Wonderful. Thank you,
All right.
Bill, for that.
Yes, thank you. Sorry about that. I was trying to focus on clicking my computer. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
So yeah, I don't know. Are we going to take questions now or wait till the end?
we're
Dan?
gonna wait to the end. I
Okay.
just as a reminder, folks can drop questions in the chat box. And yeah, thanks for that overview. Definitely an in-depth summary of the tool set, which yeah, is so important in I think guiding us to these locations, right? And tailoring the landscape. I like how you put that. Um, tailoring them to the landscape. So shifting gears a bit, Derek Churchill is on deck, and he's going to help us better understand why certain areas, landscapes, watersheds are chosen for restoration, and how that comes to be, and how that prioritization sort of helps us combat some of the disturbances being exacerbated by climate change. So, Eric, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks a lot for being here, and I look forward to it.
Okay, hold on. Oh. Okay, can you hear me there, Sam?
Yeah, loud and clear. Yep.
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here.
Derek, this is Sarah. I can only see from your nose up.
Oh, sorry there. Yeah. Okay. I'll get it here. I apologize. Coming back from the field on the Olympic Peninsula. I was out. It's actually raining quite heavily over here on the Olympics. So kind of interesting contrast to being in the dry part of Eastern Washington. Okay, well, it's great to be here. As both Sam and Bill mentioned, I'm going to be talking about sort of landscape restoration need in Eastern Washington, with a particular focus on the DNR's 20-year forest health strategy. And I'm going to start with a little bit of background on just the kind of context of the major crises that we're facing in our western forests, that really exist all over the West. If anything, we have a little bit more time here in Eastern Washington, but we're facing kind of the same issues and challenges as California, New Mexico, and so forth. And then I'm going to again talk about the 20-year plan and estimating restoration need, and then end up with some sort of preliminary numbers, if you will. We're in the process right now of really crunching these numbers of, are we treating enough? We spent a lot of effort on increasing the pace of scale, trying to restore these landscapes and prepare them for climate change. And are we moving fast enough? Where are we at? So just to start again, I've worked for about 5 years for the DNR, and we have this Forest Resilience Division, which is pretty new. When I started, we were called the Forest Health Program, and we were about 10 people tucked away in the Wildfire Division. Since then, we've grown and grown. There's about 100 people now. Some of those are moved from other divisions, and we've become our own division. And this just reflects the sort of importance that the agency, the legislature, the public is placing on forest health and forest resilience, and really trying to proactively get our forested landscapes in a condition where they can better handle drought and wildfire and other stressors that are coming. And a lot of people talk about forest health, and I just wanted to emphasize, without reading this, that we have a sort of holistic definition of forest health that we use. It's not just about whether individual trees are dying or not. It really focuses on the ecosystem and the functions that it's providing, and so forth. And so, when we think about where we're at and how we got here in our forests, there's really these sort of three converging crises, if you will. The first one is the wildfire crisis, and we hear about it every summer. And unfortunately, it seems that year after year we have another huge wildfire season. And last year in Washington, of course, was the third largest wildfire season, or second in terms of forest acres burned. And California has year after year of huge fire years, and now the Southwest and the Rocky Mountains, and everyone has seen the news year after year, right? And this sense that the fire, not just the sense, but the reality that the fires are getting bigger and also are burning hotter, typically driven by drought in combination with the buildup of fuels on the landscape. And then we have another narrative, or another part of this is this forest health crisis that, Bill talked a little bit about that. We've been suppressing fire for well over 100 years. We harvested a lot of the largest, most fire resistant trees. And that's led to a real densification of the forests, a lot more trees than there were historically. And so we've created a situation where the forests are more prone to wildfire and more prone to drought. And that's typically what we talk about when we talk about forest health in Eastern Washington, the sort of base root cause of it, if you will. And then there's this, reality of climate change, right? And it's, since I've been doing this work for about 15 years, when we started, we had climate projections. And what's quite sort of alarming is that, at least right now, again, these things vary over time, that the climate is actually warming faster than some of the predictions that we thought. And so we have actually less time than we thought we did to really prepare these landscapes. And I think you're really seeing that in California and in the Southwest, where they're just having a lot of successive drought years that cause all kinds of challenges for both forests and humans and whatnot. And so, again, this is pretty heavy stuff that I think we all struggle with. And I think the good news is that we really have an opportunity here in Washington to be proactive and make our forests more resilient. Again, just another drought monitor from last year, big drought year all over the West, and certainly in Washington as well. And so again, these elements, different crises are interconnected, right? That because of climate change, we're having and are projected to have more drought and more fire. And so this is just the projected increase in fire probability in Eastern Washington. Again, this is actually happening faster than we projected. We're also seeing these increase in drought or moisture stress. And that's typically one of the leading causes of these really huge insect outbreaks that, as in California and the Central Sierra over here, they had 4 years of intensive drought in the mid 2010s. And for the first 4 years, those 4 years, the trees did okay by and large. And then the fifth year, they kind of ran out of reserves, and you saw a lot of mortality, which led to a buildup of insect populations, which then sort of act like a out of control fire that really killed millions and millions of trees across the Central Sierra. And so again, these crises are connected, and our solutions have to be really integrated here. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit and sort of talk about some of the drill into fire a little bit more. And as I do that, I just want to define the terms that I'm going to use a lot and people use a lot in terms of fire severity. And that is simply when you have a fire, how many trees die, right? What, and not just individual trees, but what percent of the sort of overall biomass of the trees, if you will, die? Because a big tree dying matters more than a really small tree dying in terms of a fire in the forest. So we have our low severity fires where less than 20% of the biomass is killed. And typically, historically anyway, when you had a lot of low severity fire, those fires were more frequent in 5 to 35 years or so. And those were in our drier kind of ponderosa pine, lower elevation, ponderosa pine Doug fir forests. And then we had our moderate severity fires, or have, where it's that mid-range, 20 to 25 or to 70% of the trees are killed. And historically anyway, these often occurred in more moist forests. where you had Doug fir and maybe Western larch and some maybe a little bit of red cedar here and there, grand fir as well. And you had a more variable fire regime, a fire return interval where the forest may be burned every 50 years or every 80 years. They didn't burn quite as frequently. But when they did burn, more trees killed. And at the bottom, we have this high severity, and that's where, more than 70 or 75% of the trees are killed. And typically in those systems, those fires only occur every 100 or 200 years. Again, because so many trees die, that's sort of how those systems work. So again, historically, or even today, there's parts of the West or Mexico and places where when you have an active fire regime that's either was never interrupted or has been restored, these forests are highly adapted to frequent fire, and fire acts as sort of this stabilizing force, because when it burns, it again burns at low severity, just kills the small trees, burns up a lot of the fuels, which are again the shrubs, grasses, the small woody material, and so it reduces the amount of fuel in the forest. And so when you have the next fire, it's less likely to burn more intensely and kill the bigger trees. And so that, again, having more fire makes the fire more resistant and resilient to fire, right? And these forests were typically quite open, but again, with that clumpy, gappy kind of structure that Bill talked a little bit about. And then a lot of our landscape in Eastern Washington, it wasn't all low severity. We had a lot of more moderate or mixed severity landscapes, again, more in that moist forest as well. But these fires tend to be very patchy. Some places, maybe you had, like in these pictures, you'd have quite a bit of mortality, maybe 5-10 acres of most of the trees dying. Other places, it was not many trees died, and so it was a real sort of mosaic of conditions out there. And so again, that mosaic creates conditions that lead to the next fire, sort of reinforcing that mosaic. There's been a lot of research into these forests and the fire ecology of these forests, and we see this sort of pattern over and over again, and this history here where, starting about the turn of about 1900 or 1880, depending where you are, sometimes earlier, we grazed these forests. Again, we logged the large trees. Native American burning was essentially stopped for a lot of different reasons, and then we started suppressing fires. And so we saw this figure over here on the right here. That's just a fire history study, and with that, each horizontal line there is an individual tree, and each of those vertical little black marks is when a fire burned that tree. So you can see prior to 1900, there was a lot of fire every 5-10 years in this area, and then in 1900, bam, the fire stopped. So again, we see that pattern all over the West. And so what happened when you turn fire off, these are actually often somewhat productive or sometimes quite productive forests. You get a buildup of trees, of biomass. And then that creates conditions that are much more prone to what are these high severity fires that I'll talk about. So again, many of you may have seen these pictures from John Marshall, where he retook the Osborne panoramas from the 30s. And where you can really see the change in the landscape at that broader scale, where there's just more trees, a lot of those grasslands and shrublands that existed historically that were maintained open by fire have filled in, right? So it's both the densification of the patches of forest and then filling in that grassland as well. And so again, we've seen that pattern all over the West. And this, especially in the last 10 years or so, has really led to an increase in fire as the climate has warmed as well. And so we see this kind of uptick in fire. Again, one thing to note here is a lot of the acres that are reported burned every year are grassland fires or shrub steppe fires. They're not forest fires. And so, for example, in 2020, it was a big fire year. There's 700,000 acres of fire. All of that was in shrub steppe and grassland, and so it's an important distinction to make. Shrub steppe fires definitely pose risks to homes and to communities, and so but they aren't necessarily burning up forests, right? And so one thing to really remember and keep in mind is that not all fire is bad, right? A lot of the narrative around these wildfires is, it was a catastrophic fire year and it destroyed the forest. And that's just not true. In some cases, and I'll talk about parts of fires are bad and they really set back a lot of resources and functions and things that we want from forests. But in a lot of the rest of the fire actually does good work. It reduces the density. It kills some of the trees that we want to have less trees, where we want to have less trees. It burns up those fuels, the grasses and the shrub steps, and so makes it when the next fire comes, that fire is going to burn less intensely, right? And so starting that stabilizing feedback. And so we talk a lot about good fire versus bad fire. Prescribed fire is typically good fire, right? Unless it escapes and burns up a lot of homes, unfortunately, which just happened. But there's wildfires. A lot of parts of wildfires can be considered good fire as well, right? And so anyway, just an important thing to keep in mind here as we talk about fire. And so again, that in general, the moderate and low severity fire is what we consider good fire, and then it's thinning the forest, as I talked about. Killing trees. However, there's still a lot of fuel in those forests, often way too many trees. And so moderate severity fire in particular will kill a lot of those trees, but a while after the fire, those dead trees come down, and now you have a lot of fuel on the ground that can be a problem. So if we get a fire in here, we may actually lose some of those larger trees that survive the fire. So fire does good work initially, sorry here. And so so in terms of bad fire, we typically talk about high severity fire that kills all the trees. And this is especially true in those dry systems when you have old trees. And, I've spent quite a bit of time up in the Cedar Creek fire and Cub Creek fire. And I was just down in Snyder Springs fire in Southwest, near Natchez and Yakima. And there's a lot of 200, 300, 400-year-old trees, the big trees that got killed in these fires. And often the largest, big patches of these big old trees. And as we know, it takes hundreds of years to grow those back. And so that is a real loss. And what I consider bad fire in most cases. However, we also know that particularly in cold forests and even in moist and dry forests, that some high severity fire is part of the system, the way these forests work, and it creates habitat for a lot of critters. It sort of rejuvenates the forest. So not all high severity fire is bad, but the challenge is that we're getting too much high severity fire today, more than we did historically, more than we wanted. So this is just an example from 2021, where over here on the left, we have the amount of acres that we think burned historically on an average year, which varied a lot, but just to sort of create an average. So this is in dry forests. We think historically we had somewhere around 225,000 acres burned annually in Eastern Washington in our dry forest. Most of that was low severity fire with just a little bit of moderate and high, versus in 2021, you can see we had a lot of high severity and moderate and not that much low severity fire. And so that's really the challenge. It's not the amount of fire that we're having. We actually need more fire than we're having. It's that the severities are out of whack. I'm going to skip through here. So again, one of the things that we're seeing all across the West, or a lot of the West, and we're seeing here in Washington, is that we're getting these really large patches of high severity fire, right? 2,000 acres, 5,000 acres, 9,000 acres, where almost all the trees are killed, right? And this is not, we think, pretty anomalous, pretty rare historically, again, in these lower elevation ponderosa pine Doug fir forests, or more of the mixed moist forest, right? And so, this is the Methow, the Twisp River here, valley, where you can see there's just in this area been a ton of fire over the last 20 years or so years. And a lot of these large patches of red, which is the high severity, right? Some of that's in cold forests, maybe okay, but a lot of this is dry and moist forests. And so what we're starting to see is sort of the conversion of these landscapes from forest dominated landscapes with larger, mature and old trees, to landscapes dominated by young forest as well as shrubland and grassland. A lot of these places probably will regenerate eventually. The trees will come back, but we've got a predominance of young forest as opposed. And so there is a real loss of function with that for habitat and carbon and recreation and a lot of different things. And this is just one of those diagrams that Bill showed, looking at kind of comparing what the fires are doing to what we think using those historical reference conditions. And we're seeing that these fires are pushing these landscapes beyond our reference conditions. There's too much of that early seral or that post-fire condition than we think we saw historically. So, definitely something to be concerned about, especially since we're projected to get more fire. So moving into kind of what do we do about this? Again, this is the good news. In Washington, I think we're really ahead, or started earlier than a lot of states. Really with the restoration strategy that Bill talked about was, I think, at the time and even now, a really sort of cutting edge document as both a way to organize restoration and base it in science, and also as a way to say, hey, we've got this problem at a landscape scale. We need a scientifically based landscape solution and approach. And so really the 20-year plan, Forest Health Strategic Plan, sort of built on a lot of the restoration strategy. And then we also, DNR, have this wildland fire protection plan, because of course a big part of all of this is the risks to homes and to people, to structures and to communities, right, from wildfires. And so, we talk a lot about landscape restoration and ecological values and habitat and the human sort of benefits associated with that. But we also need to keep in mind, obviously, that we need to keep our communities safe from fire, as that's a paramount challenge that we have. So these plans really, I think, provide the science basis for this large scale action that we need to do, and they were developed with a ton of stakeholder input and involvement. They were definitely very much collaboratively developed plans, and are sort of the basis of the social support to do these actions. And I think DNR has played this really interesting role where 10 years ago, DNR was not involved in forest health at a broad scale or any of this work. And the state realized that in order to really protect both its own land, the state trust lands and whatnot, and just to address this larger challenge, it needed to really take a leadership role, and it needed to bring the Forest Service, the federal landowners and the private landowners and the tribes, be the agency that kind of brings everyone together and says, hey, we have this collective problem. We have to develop a collective solution here. And so the plan has these four main components. We prioritize planning areas. We do these landscape evaluations, which I'll talk about. We prioritize and implement treatments, or I should say, work with landowners to do that. And then we have a whole monitoring component as well, which I'm not going to talk about today. And to be clear, the division I work for, the Forest Resilience Division, we don't own any land. We, even though we're DNR, the state trust lands and the divisions, parts of DNR that manage the state trust lands, they're, for us, just kind of like the Forest Service. They're another land management agency that we work with. And so we develop these landscape evaluations, their recommendations, we provide funding for treatments, but we're not a regulatory agency, and we're not trying to force people to do anything. We recognize that people have their own objectives that they need to consider, their own planning processes and laws and stakeholders and so forth. At the same time, we all understand that fire is a landscape problem, and so individual landowners can't solve it on their own, right? And so I just want to emphasize again that these plans, the restoration strategy, the 20-year plan, are built really on decades of science into both the changes of these forested systems and as well as the type of treatments we need to do to fix these problems. And so it's, some people say, oh, there's uncertainty and whatnot, and there's always uncertainty in science, but this is, one of the most I think, studied and well-developed part of ecology that I certainly am aware of. And if you're interested in reading one paper that really summarizes the science in a very accessible way, there was this recent paper by Susan Pritchard and many other people that I highly recommend, that really sort of frames up the issues, the kind of core issues, and sort of at length describes summarizes and synthesizes the science around these questions and issues. So again, the 20-year plan is an all lands approach. And so we work with all landowners. And so the first step in the plan is to prioritize planning areas. And I think, you know, the whole point of prioritization is to focus your efforts in an area where you can really make enough of a difference to make a change, versus scattering your efforts too broadly and you don't see enough change anywhere, or, you know, change in reduction in wildfire risk and so forth. And so we went through a process to prioritize these landscapes. We rated all these HUC 6 watersheds on fire probability and moisture deficit, that sort of drought stress, restoration need, insects and disease. We also looked at aquatic system health, drinking water, a variety of things. And we came up with this map here, that the colors there sort of are the data driven, the risks and the values at stake in these different parts of Eastern Washington. And then we work with all our different partners, landowners and stakeholders, to select and draw lines around these planning areas, priority planning areas. And then we do landscape evaluations and focus our work here. So yeah, these are our current planning acres, about 4.5 million acres. We have a website. We have a couple different websites. If you're interested in seeing these and exploring them, you can just search for DNR Forest Health, and you'll find this map app here, and you can zoom into planning areas, and there's a whole variety of layers and so forth. And so the landscape evaluations, and that's one of the most things I do, and this is really at the core of how we estimate treatment need, because the legislature, which funded and provided the impetus to do the 20-year plan, one of the core things they said was, we want you to estimate, you know, not just you know, what the thing we need to do next, but overall, how much do we need to treat to really restore these landscapes, to really turn the corner on wildfire risk reduction, right? And, you know, we're not trying to worry about operational feasibility or cost or whatever, just at a broad level, what do we need to do to really get these landscapes in better shape? And so that's really one of the primary goals or things that we do in these landscape evaluations. So we have these different components. An HRV, a departure assessment, that's from historical conditions. We look at fire risk, drought vulnerability, and habitat, as well as these other things. And again, landscape evaluations are very much built on the principles and approaches of the restoration strategy that Bill talked about. And the two approaches really are synced. They're not different. We just use them in different sort of venues, if you will. And we work closely together with the Okanagan-Wenatchee Forest and others on the landscape evaluations for that part of the world. We work closely with the Colville National Forest and other people when we're in Northeast Washington and so forth. So again, this first step, we compare the current conditions, historical reference conditions. I think Bill covered this really well, how we do that. Then we have a map, these models that predict fire risk. And so we look at risks to both forests as well as to homes and infrastructure, and factor that in. We look at climate change projections, in particular, how that we think it's going to affect you know, the ability of certain places to support forests, and then different kinds of forests. And so in this case, this is the planning area. You can see the red here, that is sort of woodland or non-forest, and the orange is dry forest, and whereas the green is moist forest or cold forest. And so you can really see the projection of more area not being able to support forest, and that dry forest really expanding up higher and higher elevations. And really the only places that we think are going to be able to support that moisture cold forest is those north facing slopes up there. And so again, these are those climate change projections where we really realize like we don't have a lot of time. We really need to get the forest in better condition to handle that. And so again, part of that evaluation, a big part of it is this table where we estimate treatment need. And I won't go into a lot of details other than, you know, typically for any one planning area, we come out with around 30 to 40, maybe 50% of the forested acres need some kind of treatment. And so that might be, you know, density reduction treatment where we're really removing some of the you know, mid-sized trees, or it may be a treatment where we're removing more smaller trees. It might be prescribed fire or some combination of those. And then, you know, again, similar to the way Bill talked about, we prioritize where on the landscape we think those treatments need to happen. And so we look at drought vulnerability and fire risk and where those departed structure classes are. And then we also look at transmission to homes, where are places that if a fire starts there, the fire is more likely to reach homes. And so we come up with these prioritization maps here on the bottom right here. We also have a layer where we factor in habitat and particularly this large dense forest structure that supports things like spotted owls or a lot of carbon or whatnot, and say, you know, we don't need open canopy forests everywhere on the landscape. There's parts of these landscapes that we want that denser, more complex forest with large trees. We just want to make sure it's in more sustainable locations, like on those north facing slopes, in places where it can hang out for long, and where we find it on, you know, really drought prone sites. That's where we want to thin those forests and make them more resistant and resilient. So we look at, again, where are the sustainable locations to manage for that denser forest as well. And then finally here we have this component where we look at community wildfire risk reduction. I'm not going to go into detail here, but we look at these potential control lines and these pods and factor the kind of wildfire operations piece into our landscape restoration as well. Where do we need to treat to facilitate the ability of fire managers to manage these fires? You know, sometimes that may mean suppression. If it's the heat of the summer and it's risky and we need to try to put the fire out to protect the community, we're going to facilitate that. And other times of year, we may allow the fire to do more work, right, when it's safe to do that. And finally here, you know, there's, again, a lot of different types of treatments that can be done and are appropriate in different places. There's, you know, commercial harvesting where we're removing the wood. We feel that, you know, where that makes sense, where we have road access and all that, that's a great tool because it pays for itself, even can generate money to use for other parts of restoration. It removes a lot of the biomass that we need to get out of the forest because we have too much biomass. And it has economic benefits, right, particularly for rural communities that are really important to build and maintain social support for this work. There's other places where we're going to use, you know, hand crews to remove those smaller trees. And then, of course, prescribed fire is a huge tool that, you know, we really need to be doing a lot more of. And unfortunately, there's a lot of challenges to using prescribed fire at scale. And then finally, wildfires are another sort of you know, change agent that's doing a lot of work out there, as I talked about. Some of that work is good, some of that work is not good. And so for each of these landscapes, we have a report that we do. You can find all these online here for all of our priority planning areas. We have all the maps and we describe, you know, in tech, not. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here with a final piece on kind of our pace and scale component of this. And so just to kind of summarize where we're at to date, across our 28 planning areas where we've done landscape evaluations, you know, we've estimated that of the, you know, roughly 2.5 million acres of forest here, we need to treat roughly, you know, 800,000 to a little, you know, 0.1 million acres. So somewhere between 31 and 46% of the forest. And we always provide a range with these things because, again, there is no one number that's the right number. You know, the low end of the range might be appropriate in some landscapes. The high end of the range might make more sense in other landscapes. And historically, there was quite a range in conditions, depending on fire history and a whole lot of other things. So that's why we have a range there. So again, these numbers keep popping every time we do these landscapes, somewhere between 30 and about 45% of the landscape is what we need to treat with a range of treatments, right? And so we've also at DNR developed this forest health tracker where we get treatment data from all the major all the public landowners in Washington. It's online. You can go look at it if you want. You can see where treatments are being done or have been done. And so from this treatment tracker, I'm obviously not going to go through this. We, know all the at least the reported treatments in all of our planning areas. We can also look at forest practice applications on private land, because there's no way to sort of get accurate maps of those right now, at least up front. We're working on some methods with satellite imagery and to detect where changes happen on sort of commercial forest land and others. So those are kind of the numbers over 5 years in our planning areas. We had about 85,000 acres of forest health treatments and somewhere around 200,090 acres of activity on private land. But a fair amount of that is, clear cutting, regeneration, harvesting. Some of them might be thinning, some of them might be burning. And we don't know if that's all been completed or not. Those are just forest practice applications that were submitted and approved for activity on private land. And as I mentioned, wildfire is doing a lot of work out there, right? And so again, we've had a lot of fire since 1984, really since about the year 1994, 2000 is when the majority of those fires have happened. And so when you look at the footprint, a lot of our forests have burned. And so again, we kind of see this uptick in acres. And so we just did this report last year called Work of Wildfire, or WOWRAP. Work of Wildfire Rapid Assessment Report, where we tried to quantify the work, the good work and the bad work that fires are doing. And so what we saw last year was, in some cases, some fires like the Bulldog Mountain Fire was predominantly good work. It was a low severity, moderate severity fire. It burned under moderate weather conditions. The forest actually had a prescribed fire planned for this area. And the EA was all ready to go, but the wildfire got there first, and it essentially did the prescribed fire. And so they got, I think it was about 9,000 acres of fire, through this wildfire of work, which is awesome, which is great. However, we also know if the fire weather, if the weather had been different, it could have been a much bigger, hotter fire. Then we look at, 2 large fires from last year, Cub Creek and Snyder Springs. As I mentioned before, particularly Cub Creek just had a lot of high severity fire and burned up a lot of large trees and so forth. And then Snyder Springs is more mixed. We had a lot of the blue, a lot of the low severity, a lot of area where treatments were done, but then we also have these large patches of red as well. And so, the main message here is that wildfire is a very blunt tool. Yes, it does a lot of good work, but with that good work comes a lot of loss of function and bad work as well. And so, our real goal with these treatments, our mechanical treatments and prescribed fire, is to get these landscapes set up so when we do have wildfires, it's mostly good work, right? To kind of tilt the balance. So again, here's just some of those large patches. And so then looking at all of Eastern Washington, there was a study done originally by Ryan Hago et al. In 2015. A group of us led by Matt Laughlin just redid that study where we used a variety of methods to estimate treatment need across all of Eastern Washington. And this was different data sets, different methods than we use our landscape evaluations, but we came out with kind of the same, roughly 35% of the landscape needs to be treated, which was interesting. And just so you know, we're looking at the green and the sort of red orange there. That's the area that needs kind of disturbance treatment. And that kind of more purple color, that's areas where we need growth to, again, regrow those larger trees. So if you look at the top of that orange line, you can see that our restoration need hasn't really changed a lot since 1986. It's sort of fluctuated a little bit. These dotted boxes are periods we've had a lot of fire. And so you can see it sort of ticks down when we have fire. But we're still at about, there's about 10 million acres of forest in Washington. We're at about 30%. So that's somewhere around 3 million acres of treatment need across Eastern Washington. And, in the last 5 years across all of Eastern Washington, we had about 250,000 acres of treatment. Of that, only about 67,000 acres was prescribed fire. We've had, a lot of those acres have been treated on private land. A lot of that sort of commercial forestry activity, which has some wildfire benefits, but sometimes makes things worse depending on the fuel or whatnot. So sort of more of a mixed bag. And then there's this other reality that the vegetation keeps growing, right? Every year, vegetation keeps growing, the fuels keep coming back. And so we're kind of on an escalator, right? Where we're trying to treat acres, the wildfires are burning, we're taking steps down the escalator, but the escalator keeps moving up. And so this is a real challenge where, the bottom line is that I think we're making progress. We're seeing increases in the amount of acres we're treated, but we still have a long way to go to get where we really need to be. And in particular, we have to figure out how to use more fire, because that's, we can do the mechanical thinning, reduce density and those things, but prescribed fire is that last piece that really makes the treatments effective. So here's just, I think, again, some good news is we've seen a lot of evidence that these treatments work, right? They don't always work. Sometimes the wind's really strong, but in general, they work. And when you do them across, at that scale of 30–40% of the landscape, you can really change fire behavior and have much better outcomes. And so this is a photo from Oregon. Some of you may see it. I worked on this unit where the fire came from the right here, burned through this area really hot that had no treatment, hit the area that had been thinned and burned, and the fire dropped to the ground, killed very few trees. And then over here on the left, where it had only been thinned, there was a lot of fuel on the ground, activity fuels and just fuel on the ground. And it was so dry last summer that those surface fuels, those ground fuels, again, the needles and the grasses and the small branches and all that, it just boom, caught flame and pushed the heat up into the canopy and killed most of the trees there. So again, that thinning and burning is really what is the most effective. And this was a Lick Creek fire down in southeast Washington in the Blue Mountains. We saw in where there'd been a lot of treatment. So this map over here on the blue circles show where we'd had a lot of prescribed fire and mechanical treatments. And we see where, places in the fire we had low and the blue and the yellow, the low and moderate severity fire were fairly well correlated with those treatments. And that big patch of red in the middle was, where we didn't have a lot of treatment. And we saw that pattern quite a bit last summer, although in some places the wind was so strong that we saw treatments, burn pretty hot too. But in general, these treatments make a difference. And this is just a study from Alina Kanzler, which looked at all treatments over from 1984 to I think 2015, and really shows this basically the amount of purple here that's low severity fire, and as you move over to the right, and you get more of the reds and yellows, that's more high severity fire. So all of these, the untreated, thinning, and harvest, had kind of mixed effects. They all kind of helped. They were better than the untreated. They had more low severity fire. But you get over here to the left, and this is places where we had either just prescribed fire or thinning, as well as prescribed fire. And here's where you really have mostly low severity fire. And so this is a really broad study that looked at, again, all treated acres over a long time in Washington. So again, we have a ton of evidence that these treatments work, which is encouraging. So I'm going to stop there, and I think we'll turn it over for questions.
Derek, thank you for that. Wow, well, the message is strong, the densification, the more drought, the more fire. So my question is about that in particular of changing climate and adaptation. And I do wonder when I look at some of the models and the projections that you put up in your slides, I'm curious if you go out to those places that show some kind of future or potential stress out on the ground, and you stand in those places that show forest, but potentially could be non-forest. And I'm curious just to get your characterization of that particular landscape in the transition zone. And if you get out there and actually can feel the crispiness under your boots, or you get this sense of like pending change on that site. And the reason I ask that is because I also look at those colorful projections and wonder about their accuracy and ability to tell the story. All the meanwhile, I hear you say like, this is coming faster than we had expected.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the sort of there's always uncertainty in science, right? And climate change is no different, obviously. These models are complicated, but there's some basic physics about climate change, right? We're pumping all this carbon dioxide into the air. We know that traps heat, on and on, right? There's some basic physical processes that are not, based on models or whatnot. And we're just seeing it. I mean, we're seeing drought in a lot of places across the West. We're seeing, not so much in Washington, but in other places where after these big fires, forests trees are not regenerating. It's too hot and dry for trees to regenerate. There's been a lot of research recently showing that. We will probably at some point have a cooler, wetter period, hopefully, that's maybe last 5 years or so. Again, this is more in the Southwest or places, or in California, where maybe trees will regenerate, and there'll be some places where what right now we're saying, oh, this is converting from forest to grassland because of the high severity fire, and then the drier and warmer springs and summers. We're saying it's converted. Well, some of those places, yeah, maybe there'll be a cooler period where trees can establish, and then they can survive the drier conditions. And I think we also have to recognize that nature always surprises us, and we think it's all doom and gloom sometimes, and you go out and you're like, wow, I never thought this was going to happen. And our systems are fairly resilient in a lot of ways. That said, I always like to tell the story. I spent quite a bit of time in California working with forest ecologists and fire ecologists and foresters and stakeholder groups from about 2012 or so to 2015 or 16. And especially when I started, they were at that stage where the projections had, people were saying, hey, if we don't do anything, we're going to have really big fires and really big droughts. And they made some attempts and some progress, but they really didn't do nearly enough for a lot of reasons. There's a lot of people were opposed to doing large scale action, and there's spotted owls, and there's a lot of reasons why, they just didn't treat very much of the forest. And in about 2015 or 14, the drought started, and then they've had this just one incredible fire after another. A lot of the large and old trees, a lot of amazing places in California have burned in these huge high severity patches or in these large droughts. And so it's very sobering to have been at a place where people were kind of knew what's coming and didn't act fast enough, and then see it happen. And I feel like, maybe I'm wrong, I'd love to be wrong, but we're in that exact same place right now in Washington, where we have time to act, but not a lot of time. And if we dither and we don't act, in 5 or 10 or 20 years, it's going to be much, much harder to we're going to lose a lot of these resources out there. Will the forest be destroyed? No, they'll come back in different ways, but we will lose a lot of functions out there.
My name's Dwight Filer, and I have a follow-up question, Derek.
Sure.
You just mentioned that trees in many of these burned areas are not regenerating because of global warming, the intensity of the sun, the dryness. How do you address the notion that in these thinning areas, especially the more intense thinning areas, that with global warming and heat domes like we had last summer, I'm assuming you're hoping that those forests will regenerate, that there will be little trees popping up under the bigger trees you're leaving. But boy, how do you know with confidence that that's going to happen? Based on what you just said, that a lot of these areas are not regenerating.
Yeah, I mean, I think the I don't know if it's good news, but again, in Washington, we don't have quite the extreme predictions or the level of predictions of conversion from forest to non-forest. Some colleagues and I are just working on a paper right now, trying to quantify that and map where we think these conversions are, the kind of the probability of conversion in different places. And it's significant, but it's not this, huge part of the landscape. And I don't have the number on the top of my head. But it's a lot less than in the Southwest or parts of the Rocky Mountains or California or whatnot. So, and I think that, and the other part of it is people have done quite a few studies in recent years and looking at regeneration after fire, and except in those really the driest places, we get a lot of regeneration after our fires. And if anything, we get too many trees that come in, right? And then we have a problem of too many trees again. And so again, that may not always be the case. There may be some places where we don't get enough trees that we want, but by and large, all of the data that we've collected suggests that in Washington, to date anyway, we're getting enough regeneration, except for maybe on the driest edge of things. And the last part of your question, when we do thinnings and whatnot, we actually don't want a lot of regeneration. I mean, we want some because we want, again, eventually those old trees are going to die. You need younger trees to replenish those over time, but we don't necessarily want a big flush of trees, of young trees, small trees coming in, because then we have a fuel problem again, right? Where the fire can get up into the canopy. And so, again, in those really drier places I'm talking about that are likely conversion, it may be more about let's keep the large and old trees there, the existing trees, for as long as we can. And if we thin the forest, we can increase, make them more drought resistant, and also have less likelihood of a high severity fire that kills them. But eventually they may die, and those areas may convert to non-forest. We could, in those places, maybe we plant oak or other species that have trees that could live there. So I think that part of it is a manageable problem in Washington, I guess.
Thanks.
I can't say the same for other parts of the West, however.
Okay, so I'm going to turn this over to Sarah. She collected a few questions. Sarah, do you want to go ahead and ask the first one?
Sure, thanks. There are a couple that came in. So Derek, one of them relates to just what you mentioned, sort of even-aged stands. How do you work to address effects of landowners, including commercial forest, that are managing forests in a way that are incongruent with the science, i.e. they create uniformly young, dense, even-aged stands that are then highly vulnerable to fire?
Yeah, no, that's a tricky question. I mean, I think that again, we're not a regulatory agency, and I ultimately think, I've thought about this a lot, that if we were, we'd be less effective, because the minute you talk about regulation, people kind of close up and don't want to work with you, or at least a certain segment of folks. It makes it more tricky. And so, we're not in a position to tell people how they should manage their land or what's good or bad management. We recognize that some landowners have economic objectives, and that's whether that's state trust lands, whether that's timber companies, whether that's smaller private landowners, that one of their main objectives, or their main one, is to make income and produce wood. Where I think the sort of science comes in is that in places that have really high fire risk or drought risk, it's a big investment risk to plant at high density and manage an even age, with an even age system, right? All those young trees are very vulnerable to fire when they're young, and if you plant really dense, you're more vulnerable to drought. And so a lot of what we do is to be honest, we haven't worked with a lot of industrial timber owners in this plan. Most of our planning areas, some of our planning areas have a fair amount of industrial land, but it's something we haven't really tackled yet. But where we have, and in those discussions, we just bring up the fact that the risks of managing in that way, the financial risks are pretty high and getting higher. And so they kind of have a choice. They can either sell the land, or they can potentially manage in a different way that there's less income, less return, but lowering their risks, right? And so that's sort of a financial decision of risk versus financial return. And certainly in my mind, when you do that math in those places with high fire risk, it makes sense to manage in a more uneven age way where you maintain some larger trees out there on the landscape. I'll just finally say, there are parts of Eastern Washington that currently and into the future are projected to be fairly moist and productive and not have a really high fire risk. Certain places in Northeast Washington, up by Colville and, way up by Idaho border, some places down in the Klickitat country as well, maybe less so there. Maybe a few parts of the Eastern Cascades where, it's probably from, again, fire risk and drought risk perspective, you can manage in that way, and it's probably going to be okay into the future. But again, that's not a lot of area, and it is shrinking.
Thanks, Derek. I'll queue up the next one for you. So given that shrub steppe and grasslands are so intermixed in Eastern Washington with forests and communities, is DNR looking at wildfire risk analysis and reduction planning for grasslands and shrub steppe habitat?
Sorry there. Yes, there is Alan Leibovitz has this, he's works with the executive team, and is a wildfire sort of policy advisor. He has an initiative working with a variety of people on shrub steppe. Both the issue of kind of shrub steppe restoration, which of course, if you restore the bunch grasses and try to reduce the amount of cheatgrass, then shrub steppe burns less intensely and less frequently. So there's a dual benefit there from less fire risk to communities and better habitat and better ecosystems. So yeah, there is a group working on that. We also have our fire scientist, Anna Barros, when we do these dual benefit analyses. Right now, we do incorporate the shrub steppe. She's working on some ways to sort of build in the fire management piece of that, those PCLs and pods and whatnot, in a more robust way. But we currently do it. It is a little challenging because we don't have as many maps that quantify fire risk from the shrub steppe. But yeah, it's a big challenge. A lot of communities are working on this issue as well. Using prescribed fire, potentially grazing, or again restoring bunch grasses as a way to reduce the amount of fire, or how often these places burn, and then the intensity of fire when they do burn.
Sarah, were there any more questions? I'm gonna wait another couple seconds to see if Sarah's still with us.
I am. Thank you for your patience.
Wonderful.
There was a related question that came in ahead of the forum tonight. It relates to sort of bitterbrush and cheatgrass. You may have just sort of alluded to this, Derek, but is bitterbrush something that folks should be concerned about as a fire hazard, or should they worry about clearing it with firewise practices? Is it maybe not so important? why is bitter brush intact after fire passes through in some areas? If it's highly flammable, sort of a shrub step related habitat.
Yeah. Yeah, I personally probably don't, I'd be kind of just arm waving a little bit to answer that question. So I don't know if Bill or someone else wants to tackle that.
Looks like Bill might be able to help you.
I can add a little bit there. I've done some work with bitter brush. We actually tried to burn it to rejuvenate it for wildlife habitat, but it is highly flammable under the right conditions. So in terms of the work you do around your house, I would definitely manage it. Sometimes it survives fire relatively well. It just depends on the severity of fire. It also depends on the time of the year. Sometimes I've seen bitter brush burn very high severity, but it will root sprout and come back fairly quickly. At other times, if the root crown is killed, it will not resprout. So it is pretty sensitive to fire, but it depends on the timing, the soil moisture at the time of the fire, and the severity of the fire.
Thanks, Bill. All right, I've got another one for you both. Within the Washington State 20-year strategic plan, what percentage of post-fire landscapes do you project to receive forest restoration treatments? Or do you write them off and remove those areas from the projected acres needing restoration?
That's a great question. So I think, one of the sort of challenges and realities that has the Forest Service in particular, but even some other, well, less so other agencies, that has happened is, when an area burns, there's some immediate post-fire management, both kind of stabilization and whatnot, and maybe some replanting, maybe some salvage and logging in that. But and then it's sort of, okay, that area burned, let's go back to work on the unburned portions of the landscapes. But we know that, again, these fires do a lot of work on these landscapes, particularly the really big fires. And there's a lot of need to do different kinds of management or stewardship over time in these landscapes, whether that's trying to replant some of these big patches of high severity to make sure we get some regeneration. Although, again, for the most part, we tend to get it, but that may be, or if we want to plant more climate adapted species in some places, that's an opportunity to do that after a fire. There's certainly a lot of cases where, that moderate severity fire in particular, it killed a lot of trees and opened up the canopy and left a lot of the bigger, larger trees. But there's an opportunity right after the fire to go in and remove / harvest some of those dead trees, as well as some of the green trees. Often the fires don't kill enough green trees. We don't quite get the density reduction we need. And so we call it finishing the job. The fire started the job, and then you can go in and finish it. And if you do that right after the fire, you can have that pay for itself. As opposed to, if you don't do that, then 10 years after the fire or 15 years, you've got all that fuel on the ground, and it becomes much harder to do a prescribed fire to deal with that fuel. Or if a wildfire burns, you're at higher risk of killing the remaining trees. So again, that's not appropriate everywhere, but I think it makes sense in more places on the landscape. And yeah, there's a variety of other, in these landscapes, there's often low severity areas that burned the surface fuels, the grasses and the small stuff, but it didn't thin the canopy in these dry places. And so there's still a need to do a density reduction treatment in some of those low severity areas. And so, yeah, there's a lot of work to do in these places. And so that was one of the reasons we did this work of wildfires report, was to take the first step in saying, okay, what did the wildfire do? What are some initial post-fire management things we need to think about? And now we're working on what are the longer term needs. And so we haven't taken on a landscape that is like mostly burned yet as one of our planning areas. We very well might do that. Like the Snyder Springs fire is a good example. We have had quite a few smaller fires within our planning areas. And so we do right now, we don't just write those areas off in our treatment need. We look at, okay, is there still treatment need within the fire perimeter? But we're still fleshing out those methods, I should say, about exactly how we do that.
I just add that I think the landscape evaluation is a tool that you can use in a post-fire environment to see what work did the fire do for you that was good, and what work do you need to finish the job, so to speak. I've also seen some good use of post-fire harvest to address some of those fuels that are left behind. The trick is that you sort of have to have your plan in place before the fire, because you have to get on that pretty quickly in order to capture that economic value. Because you still want to retain the larger tree structure. Those are not the fuel issues. It's the smaller wood, and that has a pretty short life in terms of its economics.
Thanks, Bill. Derek, did you have something to add, or are you ready for me?
I was just going to say, yeah, we've actually done quite a few post-fire landscape evaluations where what Bill mentioned, where we go in and we quantify how the fire changed, move us towards or away from our desired conditions in terms of forest structure and patch sizes and all that, and then from that, yeah, we come up with a post-fire landscape evaluation. So we actually did some research and have a kind of a strong basis for that, and now we're figuring out to really formalize or more launch that program, or that component of the 20-year plan.
Thanks. Next one. In general, what proportion of acres that are mechanically thinned on public lands are also treated with prescribed fire? Without fire, the treatment seems akin to a rearrangement of fuels.
We don't know that, that exact number. Again, that's one of the roles DNR has played, is to finally say, okay, let's really try to get a handle on across all landowners, how much are we treating, how much fuels treatment, or again, the prescribed fire. You can do mechanical fuels treatments where you pile and burn the material. That is another alternative. You can't do prescribed fire everywhere. We do know that we're not doing nearly enough prescribed fire. We're behind on just burning those treated areas, but I can't give you a number right now.
I think most cases the plan calls for some sort of fire follow-up. It's the ability to implement that is a challenge with the air restrictions. And there are other tools that can be made available to deal with those fuels. But a lot of times they're quite expensive, and they do not replace the ecological value of having fire on the ground.
Right. And I'll just throw in one other depressing thing here that's the reality is that when we have these big drought years, our ability to do prescribed fire is much less. And we saw that last year, and for two reasons. One, it's much riskier to do prescribed fire. And then two, all of the resources, the people to do the prescribed fire are either on fires in other parts of the West, or in the fall, they're just completely burnt out because they've been treating fire, on fire after fire all summer. And so again, that brings us to when we have a year like this year, which is more moderate, we've got to figure out how to do a lot of prescribed fire in this more moderate years, and every year counts. That's what I think people kind of forget. Oh, well, we can't do it this year. It's too hard. We'll just wait. And every year counts, especially the years where we have more moderate fire weather and the opportunity to burn more acres.
Thank you. Next one. Are good wildfire results included in metrics of restoration accomplishments annually?
Yes, another great question. So the answer is we're moving in that direction. Currently, in the Forest Health Tracker, internally we quantify, and we did this in the report, the amount of low and moderate severity fire in dry and moist forests. And there's a table in there. We include the numbers. We don't necessarily say, we just say that, we think those are good acres that are good work that wildfire did. We don't necessarily add them together in the report. We leave that for people to do. because of this, as a follow-up to this work of wildfire effort that we're doing, we actually just had a big sort of science web-based meeting to figure out to do exactly this. Like, how do we formally incorporate the work of wildfire, the good work, into our treatment tracking and whatnot. And so, you know, there's some nuance in doing that, both sort of technically and ecologically, and then also ultimately each landowner has to report to us saying, yeah, this fire burned these acres and we think it was good work and met our objectives. Because that's the way the treatment tracking works. Landowners report to us and tell us, yeah, these acres are treated. So it's in process.
Okay. The next one is grazing considered in the preventative and rehabilitation plans?
Bill, you want to take a crack at that? I'm giving you all the shrub step ones.
Not directly, like in a restoration sense. I am aware of certain specific situations where in the grasslands, especially adjacent to communities, grazing has been more on an experimental basis, but applied to reduce the fuels, the finer fuels. So I think there's some potential there, but I haven't seen it done on a really broad scale.
Okay. There was another one that came in ahead of the presentation tonight related to historic condition. How do you know what the forest looked like a few hundred years ago before you know, the tools and photo interpret methods we have today?
I'll take a crack at that on the stand level, or, you know, a 10 acre or 20 acre patch of forest kind of level. I actually did a lot of my dissertation work doing this, and we call it forest archaeology. And you know, select a particular, you know, 10 acre site or 20 acre site, and you determine which are the trees that were alive, say 100 years ago or 120 years ago. And you can tell from the bark, you know, the size of the tree, the bark characteristics and the branches, which are the old trees. And of course you core, put an increment bore in and count the rings. So you calibrate the aging of the trees. And we end up coring a lot of trees to determine their age and whether they're alive then. And then you look at the snags and the down logs and make some determinations, you know, was this a tree that we think was alive back then? You know, and there's models about decay, rates of decay, and decay classes over time that we use to say, you know, we think this tree died, you know, 30 years ago, and it's a pretty big tree, so it's probably at least 100, you know, you can tell. And again, there's a little bit of guesswork involved in that. We call it the archaeology. And then we can create a map of the trees that were there, you know, 120 years ago. And then we core a lot of those trees to get the growth rates, and then we grow the forest back in time to get the actual size of the trees. And so from that, we get the species composition, the density, the size of the trees, as well as the spatial pattern, that kind of clumpy, gappy pattern we see in these forests. And so there's been a lot of this kind of, we call it reconstruction work, in, you know, all across the West, in Oregon, Washington, you know, all over. And it's pretty remarkable. A lot of these reconstructions show quite similar forest structure when you have frequent fire.
I think at the landscape scale, we rely on kind of multiple lines of evidence, if you will. So some of the work that Paul Hesberg and his lab did, they went back and used some historical photos down back to the early 1900s. Other tools are some of the old forest inventories done around the turn, you know, the early 1900s, late 1800s, give some indication as to the prevalence of different types of structure of forest. And then the other tool often is a modeling routine, where you build a model that mimics the different kinds of forests, and you then can, in a modeling environment, allow fire to do its natural thing until you get this sort of estimate of what the historic range of those different forest structures look like. The best estimates of HRV incorporate all those tools, and you just hope that the lines of evidence pointing in the same direction. And a lot of that work has been done in our Eastern Washington forest. So we actually have some pretty solid information about what those historical forests look like.
Thank you. I have a related question from someone that joined a little late. I think you touched on this generally, but do you have historical data on mixed severity fire and the need for that?
Similarly to what I described, the kinds of forest structures that we get from those historical stand reconstructions, a lot of times we look at what did it look like in the drier forest, where the low severity, the mixed severity, and the high severity. So we're able to sort of parse that out and get, either in a reconstruction world or in a modeling world, some idea of what those mixed severity forests look like.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just say that, at a landscape level, we are, that the historical photos or modeling work or other stuff, that historical inventories, those tend to cover the whole landscape or most of the, so we have a lot of information on the moisture sort of mixed severity part of the landscape for those landscape patterns. At the stand level, we probably have less, there is some, but not as much in the dry forests. And it is more complicated because it's, again, more of that mosaic-y, patchier thing. So there's more variability in the mixed severity zone. But there is a fair amount of data from it. And the other aspect of mixed severity is that you can look at mixed severity today or in more recent times, because some of those forests, they may have only missed one fire, and so they're not necessarily that different. When a fire happens today, we think it's maybe not as departed or as different as a low severity forest that maybe has missed 5 or 6 or 10 fire return intervals, right? And so some of the contemporary fire effects we can look at and see, okay, how do these forests look after fire or whatnot? And there's been quite a bit of studies doing that, particularly in wilderness areas or places where we've had repeat fires in that mixed severity zone, like in the Bob Marshall in Montana or in Idaho, and also in California as well, and other parts of the Rockies.
Great. Well, I have one more that came up ahead of the meeting that was sent in, and then we had one last one that I think is a little bit hard to fit in the chat box. So we'll save that one for verbal at the end. Thanks for your patience. We're a little after 8, but I think the questions are great. The one that I had for you guys that had come in earlier was, what would you recommend as the best way to craft messaging around need for these treatments, riverine processes and resiliency, when you're communicating with maybe different stakeholder interests?
It's a really good question. I think that the way it was couched in the forest health strategy, I think a lot of people relate to this concept of forest health, and if it's used in a holistic manner, like Derek shared with us. So I actually think that the way it's been sort of presented in this forest health strategy is a good way to approach it. It's probably a good source because it's pretty understandable. It takes a lot of the jargon out of it. When we throw terms around like resiliency and landscape, sometimes people that's a challenge. But if we can rate it back to forest health and risk to communities and some of those concepts, then it brings it home to folks.
Thanks. Well, that was all that I had queued up, written in text in the chat for you guys. Before we conclude, I think, was it Dwight? You had one more question that you wanted.
Sarah, I just want to say one thing on that last point.
Please.
I think that's something that how to communicate these messages that scientists certainly wrestle with, DNR, and so whether it's this North Central Collaborative or other, if you have ideas or thoughts on methods or ways or messages that resonate or don't resonate, I think giving us feedback or other people feedback is really critical, right? Because the communication part is tough, and we're not I don't think anyone's an expert at it. So it, takes all hands in a way to craft best messages, and no one message is going to reach all different kinds of people. So yeah, we can use help with that.
Yeah, agreed.
And Dwight, do we still have you? You're patient.
Yes, you do. I just unmuted myself. And I apologize for jumping in with that first question. I didn't realize the process. So anyway, a question for both Bill and Derek concerning Paul Hesburgh's research. And I got a couple real brief questions to ask before I ask my main question, because I need to know that I'm understanding what you said earlier correctly. So the reference condition that Paul Hesburgh's research refers to, he's referring to pre-contact time. So I'm assuming from something Bill said recently that you're looking at about 1900, say, roughly. So before Europeans altered the forest.
Yeah, dramatically anyway.
So
But we
basically,
still had Native American influence to some degree.
so you're talking about a decade around the turn of the last century, roughly, right? Okay. So is it true that then with these treatments, you're shooting for the forest conditions that existed in 1900?
Yeah, so typically what we're doing actually is we're looking at the historic range of variability, and we're also looking at that future range, right? That warmer, drier range. So we know as climate changes, the range of the conditions are going to change. And a lot of times there's an overlap between the FRV and the HRV, and that's actually what we usually use for our desired condition for management, because it accounts for where the forests come from, and it also accounts for where it's going. Does that make sense, Dwight?
Yeah, actually, that was kind of the crux of my question. My question was, and I'll just read it, but I think you more or less answered it. Since pre-contact times, global warming has kicked in a huge way. And how can we use pre-contact reference conditions in our current rapidly changing environment?
Yeah, no, you raise a great point about relying just on HRV. I will couch that though, is in this. If our forests in Eastern Washington looked anything like they did historically, our job of creating more resilient conditions would be much, much easier.
And I think there's something important to understand about fire, or just sort of recognize in that it, kept biomass levels, well below carrying capacity, especially in, the more a little bit more productive parts of the landscape. And so, and we see that, right? When you turn off fire, you get all these trees growing in there, right? And so we think that fire maintained conditions that really had a pretty big buffer against warmer, droughtier conditions, right? Because there's just not very many, the density is so much lower than the site can actually support. And so often I think, those historical conditions are certainly a pretty good starting place or a guidepost for climate adaptation. And that's really, just to be clear, the goal of using these reference conditions isn't to restore those conditions per se. It's that we think those conditions, and we don't just think, we know from a lot of evidence that they were able to tolerate a lot of fire, fluctuations in climate, warmer periods, cooler periods, insect outbreaks, tolerate all that disturbance while maintaining a lot of the functions, whether it's habitat or water or carbon or all these things we want. So that's why we use the reference conditions. But we also, I'll just say finally, that those moisture deficit predictions that I showed, that is something we really factor into all of those treatment prioritization and so forth, and even some of the treatment targets, right? So that is a very sort of direct way of bringing in the future climate into this.
Great question, Dwight, though. Yeah. Did we get there?
Unless there are more questions coming into the chat that I haven't seen, we hit them all, and we got the ones that were submitted in question form ahead of time. And I realize we ran a little long, but I just wanted to take the time to thank everybody that attended and that tuned in, and for your time in the forest and out of the forest, Derek, today. And Bill as well, both of you weighing in on these not so simple topics. And Sam, I'll let you wrap it up.
Yeah, just one more, appreciation to Bill and Derek for today, and a deep gratitude for your commitment to this breadth of work that's so important. I recognize that, and for providing it to the general public. It's really valuable. So cheers. Yep. And thank you everyone for spending your evening with us. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill and Derek.
Good night.
Thanks,
all.
Chris.
We recorded this session, so it'll be available on the interwebs sometime soon.